McCarthyism. I find it quite ironic that there are some people now on the progressive left side of politics who now want to resort to the same kind of tactics. I'd like to start by making the point that in the context of this debate, so-called cancel culture is obviously a big, big issue. And I think it's real, but I also think it's exaggerated. It's often applied too quickly or without proper evidence to back up the justification. And we see that very clearly in Twitter or X-mob pile-ons. Just to give you one example, I don't agree with Germaine Greer's stance on trans rights. I think she's a great feminist, but I think she's wrong on this issue. But I very much oppose attempts to cancel her. For example, at Cambridge University, I thought the best way to deal with that was to debate her, to protest, to put the counter-arguments, but not to use the threat or the actuality of cancellation. In the end, of course, she wasn't not cancelled. She did go ahead and speak. But it's an example of where the conflict between freedom of speech and the right for vulnerable, persecuted minorities to be protected, that intersection is a problematic one. I certainly think that naming and shaming has often worked for the public good. So, for example, nowadays, compared to 40, 50 years ago, it is regarded as completely beyond the pale to be racist. And that is because racists have been named and shamed. So it means that racism is probably much less, it hasn't been eradicated, but it'd be much less today than it would be if there wasn't that threat of naming and shaming. And that is good for Black, Asian, and other non-white communities. One of the justifications for naming and shaming is that it can act as a deterrent against abusive behavior, threats, and incitements. And I'll give you a good example. I was involved 2 decades ago in a bid to cancel Jamaican reggae stars who were advocating the murder of LGBT plus people. They weren't merely homophobic, they were actually saying that LGBT plus people should be shot, drowned, hanged, burned alive. And for me, this was beyond free speech. Free speech does not include the right to threaten and incite violence. So I organized a campaign to get their concerts cancelled and came in for a lot of stick from a lot of people. I was even accused of racism. We weren't targeting their race, we were targeting their incitements to murder. But the upshot was that the production of that music went way down. And as a result, the attacks on LGBT plus people in Jamaica very dramatically reduced. So there, I think, is a good example of how naming and shaming, cancelling, can actually work for the public good.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Finally, to Sophie.
Well, I'm going to just pick up on, I think, one word in the question which sort of worries me a bit, and this idea, should we excise it from our culture? And I can say, well, that straight away, sort of before I even start sort of worrying about, you know, what I feel shame is or isn't or how it works, I can answer that one quite simply, no. Because the minute we start appointing ourselves as gatekeepers for what constitutes acceptable or unacceptable amounts of shame, I think we're into a problematic situation. For example, can you imagine if we made this commitment that we were going to excise shame from our culture, and it was not nice, and we must be nice, it's nice to be nice, etc. What does that do to things like satire and things like that? Who starts to then police what is an acceptable amount of provocation? As Peter, I want to pick up on some of the things Peter was saying here, shame is actually, you know, has had a very double edge, or it's got multiple political dimensions to it. It's been an incredibly powerful tool for positive and for negative. And sort of bracketing all that for a moment, I'm sort of fairly persuaded that actually the conversation that interests me is not necessarily how do we get rid of shame like it's something we would control. I think all that would happen is it would go underground and you would get increasingly more nefarious, devious practices of it. So maybe the conversation to have is, well, how do we do it better? Which might sound weird, but okay, how do we shame better? And I'm sort of thinking, drawing on my research into kind of activist cultures and histories, particularly non-violent, and particularly actually ironically in the peace movement, you get some really interesting examples of how shame's been incredibly important tool. I'll give you an example. In the 1950s Cold War and going into the 1960s peace movement, Gandhi was a very, very, very influential figure. And a particular Gandhian idea that was picked up was this notion of Satyagraha. And Satyagraha is where you carefully craft a display or a spectacle of taking shame upon oneself, of mortifying oneself, of experiencing pain and embarrassment, humiliation, in order to communicate a bigger, more powerful truth. So you take shame upon yourself in order to trigger the shame mechanism in the people that you're trying to communicate with. And this was used to really interesting, quite amazingly powerful effect by people who made a commitment not to use force, not to use violence in any other way, but were really trying to figure out, well, what are the mechanisms of mind change that really work? And their view was that, okay, we could use reason, we could use reasonable arguments about why nuclear weapons are terrible, awful, evil, destructive things which hand governments ultimate power. We could do that and we'll reach some people. But if we want to reach a lot of people, the thing which most compels people to deep, meaningful and permanent change is that moral conscience, exercising that, motivating that, pressing that button. And so I think that whilst obviously there are parameters of shame and shaming practices we need to be conscious of, I say it's a much more complex and interesting political tool than just working at those simple levels alone.
Thank you, Sophie. I'm conscious here that we're talking across many decades, but of course the experience of being shamed and the experience of shaming is very different now to what it might have been when you were living in a tiny village community and tarring and feathering your least favorite neighbor. Now shaming has taken on an entirely new association, which is one that goes far beyond yourself and can incorporate your family, your friends, your workplace, and even further, there's almost a nuclear blast radius around people who are publicly shamed these days, part of which is because of the vehicles of shaming, one of which is social media, that's been mentioned earlier today. That also means the internet allows you to remain shamed for days, weeks, if not years, perhaps even your whole life. You know that a record of your shaming will always be kept online. So I'm interested to think about how particularly contemporary shaming works here, and how that could either be a social good or a social ill. A greater question I suppose I want to then continue this debate with and open us up to is shame a net force for good? Is it something that in total brings about more positive change than it does negative change? So I guess that's where I want to start. Perhaps, Peter, I'll turn to you. Because, of course, you speak there about your own personal experience of doing the shaming, but you also speak about your defense of people who are currently being shamed, and how that experience might not actually help change their minds. Yeah.
Well, I just would like to throw back a bit of history, which we'll all be familiar with, McCarthyism. There was a very negative, reactionary form of shaming, together with the Hollywood blacklists, to try and silence liberal progressive opinion. And I find it quite ironic that there are some people now on the progressive left side of politics who now want to resort to the same kind of tactics. I think you have to be really, really careful. The social media witch hunts over Phillip, Schofield and Hugh Edwards, I think are very classic and recent examples of a very dangerous lynch mob mentality, where people jump to conclusions without all the evidence. It's since come to light, no laws were broken, but the degree of shaming of those two men, based on their own personal, private behavior, which, as far as we know, the key people in both cases have not complained, they've raised no objections. That's a really a good example, I think, of the danger of reckless, irresponsible naming and shaming, where the full facts are not known, and where, in fact, some people are trying to impose their personal morality on these particular people and society at large. I just want to give also another example. A justification for a naming and shaming is that it can act as a deterrent against abusive behavior, as I mentioned. It can also be a catalyst for people to review, reevaluate, or reconsider their actions or words. So it can prompt change for the better. But of course, people should also, in my view, be given a chance of redemption, to express regret, to say sorry, to take words and actions to prove that they have changed. Now, I'll just give you a brief example. Back in the 1990s, Michael Portillo was the Defense Secretary of State. He was in charge of witch hunting LGBT plus people out of the armed forces, which was bad enough in itself, but made even worse by the fact that he had had a same-sex relationship in his younger years. And myself and the LGBT plus group Outrage, we named and shamed him. We dogged him throughout the Kensington by-election. Wherever he went and spoke, we called him out over his homophobia and hypocrisy. He had previously voted against all anti-gay reform, all gay law reform. But sometime after, when he won that by-election, he suddenly began voting in favour of LGBT plus equality. And I'm told that the experience of being mobbed and shamed by Outrage was very traumatic, but it did force him to reevaluate his public position. And thereafter, he began voting for LGBT plus equal rights. So there's a positive example of shaming working where the hope of redemption was fulfilled.
We hit up against maybe our first kind of wall of the afternoon here, which is there is, of course, you must accept a subjectivity to that in the sense that you feel the outcome of that shaming was positive. It's positive according to your personal set of morals and your personal set of beliefs. Now, of course, someone else may well shame with their own subjective set of moral ends in mind and have an entirely different outcome, or one that you think is actually a net negative. I'll turn to Joanna here.
Can I just pick up on that? I mean, I would say it's not my personal beliefs. Well, it is partly my personal beliefs.
It is also your personal
beliefs. But it's also established in our equality laws and international human rights agreements. So I was merely implementing.
It is now, but only because of the shaming to some extent.
Yeah,
you say the legislation literally changed because of shaming. So actually it wasn't at the time. You had an idea of what it ought to be and you shamed in that direction. Yeah. So there's a question there of if someone shamed in the other direction, might that be their own subjective right in a kind of culture where we accept shame as some sort of progressive force? Joanna, tell me why actually, in fact, shame is not worth the trouble.
So I really want to turn to Twitter, and I suppose it's now called Twix or whatever it's called. But I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But I first of all both Sophie and Peter, I agree with lots of what you're saying. Sorry, Florence. But,
no, that's all right.
But I think that whole thing of shame as an inner conscience, I mean, this is Aristotle. We were talking about Aristotle just as we came over. Aristotle says it's between vanity and cowardice. It's somewhere in the middle and might. And the Greeks have a goddess of shame, Eidos, who's meant to just keep you a bit in check. And so there's you can see it's a completely intrinsic aspect of our lives as flawed mortals in a way. We can't escape it. And also thinking about what Peter's saying, I think it's something about power that, again, I've been reading a lot of slightly ancient texts recently, and the Amduat is the ancient Egyptian book of what happens in the afterlife. It's like the kind of rough guide to the afterlife, the Lonely Planet guide, if you arrive. And the main thing you want to do in the afterlife is not be eaten by demons. That's the crucial thing. And the way you stop them from eating you is you name and shame them. You know their names and you give them their names. And so you talk back to them, you tell them what they are. And so it's very kind of profound, this power dynamic. And I think what's happening, and as Peter's saying, it's almost if you have a society where all the shame goes downwards, that's complete repression and total control. And I think with the internet coming into that, there was that amazing period early on in Twitter, Twix, when it first began, when there was a kind of counter-shaming going on. People sort of surged and they had a power of their own to talk back and the old authorities that had everything going top down were suddenly being talked back to. What's happened now is that's now been monetized massively by big tech companies. And so there's this whole architecture of driving all the algorithms into one form of pylon or another. So there's that authenticity and desire for change, but it's being monetized into these huge shamings. And that's just a question about what we do about that, really. Does it destroy the effects of it if it's making huge amounts of money for a big tech authority kind of panopticon that's sort of in tune with our governments, and the permeable boundaries are quite clear? And I just wonder, to ask you both as well, what that does to that process.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below, or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.